Good morning, everyone.
Good
morning.
How are you?
Oh, man, I'm great. Heidi, thank you for coming by.
Lovely to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Heidi, I've enjoyed all of our conversations, so I really can't wait to get into it. But you are our current in a growing repertoire of guests that we get to talk about stuff we would never have lined up as a health topic, right? Like it's not, when I think of divorce, I got to be honest with you, health is not the first thing that comes to my brain.
Sounds like the first thing to go, actually,
Yeah.
Mental health.
Yeah, but once you start peeling that onion, almost immediately you're like, oh, well, shit, like that's absolutely true. I mean, I have a couple friends, unfortunately, that have had extremely bad divorces, and now we can look back with hindsight, it's years later, and they're just not super healthy folks, right? And I'm like, I'm not wondering, mostly because of our conversations, any longer about why that is. I'm kind of pretty dialed into it. But before we jump into any of that, I wanted to just say how cool it was. You and I first talked about my project that's on pause right now about metacognition and your mother's work and everything. And I love your backstory from that lens, because I think it really helped inform just like how you approach this project. So I was wondering if you wouldn't mind kind of taking us back just a step or two and kind of telling us that neat story, and because it'll dovetail right into what we're going to talk about today.
Sure. Yeah, I guess sort of like the overarching theme is sort of out of the box, or why do we do things the way we do things? Or how constrained are we by paradigms that we're sort of like given, or history? And I guess, the story you're referencing, and correct me if I'm going off course here, but my mom was the start of the first program for college-able dyslexics in the United States.
That would be the very one I'm talking about.
And, that was born of the experience of having my brother, who is dyslexic, didn't learn to read until he was about 10. And that was by virtue of her teaching him. And she knew he was really smart, but the school just didn't have a way to teach him to read. So she started doing research, and she had been trained as a teacher, but she was actually, I'll go back even further. She was in, what would it have been, about 1937 or something, teaching in the Boston public schools. And she was teaching the Merchant of Venice. And this is the way she told the story. I'll tell it as best I can. 10th grade English. And she had one guy in the class was just like the brightest. Clearly, he was the one on top answering all the questions, got the story, and then she gave them their first assignment, written assignment. And he passed in his paper, and she said, this is like a joke, like no sentence in here, there's no paragraphs, spelling's horrible. Like, why did you do this? And he said, just fail me like everybody else has. She said, no, I can't. Clearly you understand what's going on. I just, I don't understand this. Like, why don't we work together after school? So she started working with him, and that was really her first introduction to what dyslexia was, although she didn't have a name for it. She was a young teacher, and she then got cut. She always referred to it as her Christmas present that December when they cut the Boston school teachers who were new. So, but it stayed in the back of her mind, that there was this sort of, she'd never experienced it herself other than with this young man. And then, I guess, as my brother would quip, that he had a problem and she made it into a career. But she was, it recalled, I think, that experience. And she knew that there was something that she had to figure out. And she started doing research with some doctors at Mass General Hospital in Boston who were on the sort of cutting edge with dyslexia. Went back to school ultimately to do her doctorate in education, and started doing research on how people learn differently. And ultimately what she created was this program that, dyslexia means word blindness. That is what it actually means. And she partnered with what was then only the, so-called the Center for the Blind, I think, which had textbooks on tape, but got every textbook in the country on tape so that it was then tape, audio tape. Now, people download things all the time on Audible or on, from
I've
library.
got 20 in my library right now, just waiting for me to not read them.
But at the time, if you couldn't read textbooks, you couldn't go to college.
Yeah.
So what the program she did is that kids could actually listen to the books, have a tutor, read them simultaneously, sort of strengthen their challenges, challenge their strengths, learn to write, and they had that support for the first year of college. And then they were expected to pretty much launch on their own. But, if they needed a little bit more ongoing assistance, I'm sure it was provided. But they could have the information, they could receive the information in another form, which was auditorily. So that was revolutionary at the time in 1970, I believe. They took over 50 years.
I was born in 76. You talk about this like it was like 1,000 years ago. I'm like, I was probably alive when this was happening.
It always seems so amazing when something that you take for granted is like relatively like within your lifetime, right? It's like it wasn't that long ago.
Yeah, amazing, really amazing. In fact, we on the website for the Webb Innovation Center for Dyslexia, the website's called dyslexicswanted.com. And someone
awesome.
on it, you can submit sort of your story, like a recording of your story. And I was just listening to one this morning, actually, with a guy who was, probably in his late 50s, talking about his experience of being, I don't want to say shuttled into vocational school, because he did have a lot of technical skills, but no one had identified him as being dyslexic till he was, way into his 50s, having had a career in technology.
And the thing that struck me about this story then, and again just now, is that like this is the kind of stuff you just can't teach somebody, right? Like it's really hard to teach somebody that level of observation and action. That I mean, it really is an intangible in any way I could describe it. And that's why I thought it was a neat backstory, because if you grew up in this environment and you're like forged from that cauldron, like there's almost no chance that you're looking at things the way, we'll call it normal people look at stuff, right? You know what I mean?
The weirdest thing is Matt and I had a conversation last night with an NLP practitioner.
Oh, funny.
And she was literally saying like, look, the programming we basically get comes from that, what is that early age?
0 to 5.
0 to 5, right? And if you're growing up in that environment, how could you not at least have some of the career arch that you have now?
Yeah. I guess that's true. It's sort of, my kids sort of like joke about the fact that I sort of did what grandma did. It's sort of like a different field, but there is a lot of truth in that, just sort of saying, there's another way to approach this. That, why do we have to be tied in my, from my perspective to, feudal law and, contract law from, the ages.
We're still, why is this conversation sound so relevant right now?
Yeah.
Don't get me started.
So that is the backdrop. So I thank you for sharing that. But like that sort of that's how you sort of viewed the world. And so when you got into your professional life, like, did you start in the divorce arena, or did we end up there through another process? How do we get there?
Well, before I went to law school, I did my master's in counseling, consulting, psychology at Harvard, and I was always sort of, once I went to law school, looking for ways to integrate these two paradigms, I guess. So although I was eager to be a litigator and I enjoyed the courtroom, people often say taking away the courtroom from a lawyer is like taking away the OR from a surgeon. It's sort of like, that's the fun for, as a technician or as someone who likes sort of that process. It's a really, it's a intriguing place to be. But I've had this perspective on human development, child development that sort of informed what I was doing. And I had also been trained as a mediator during law school. So, I was always looking to integrate and help people solve problems in ways outside the courtroom, even though the lens that I used was the court process that I sort of had worked hard to understand. So, my frame of reference was, okay, so we're filing a complaint and we're getting on the, road to discovery and we're working through the court process. And while we're doing that, I'm trying to apply these other skills. And that was sort of how I was approaching my practice, I'd say. but I was always interested in families and in human dynamics, and that's where I had wanted to be. I should say, I went into a practice that had been established by my grandfather in 1912.
Wow.
Wow.
Here.
Wow.
And one of the
Yeah.
things that was required was that I go through they didn't have a family law practice. They ultimately said, if you want to do that, we'll help you sort of establish that, but you need to go through the other, practice groups here first. So that actually was really helpful because I had then gained information about and knowledge and experience in real estate and in,
Wow.
you know,
It almost sounds like how med students end up having to do rounds in different departments so they can kind of see what everything looks like.
Right. But all these things, estate planning, real estate, they're parts of divorce. So, if you benefit a lot by sort of understanding these things more deeply than just sort of
That's
like going
interesting.
right into a siloed practice that's like a boutique divorce practice that doesn't really give you that more breadth. In any event, I did want to practice that way, but after I had my third child, I decided that I wanted to stay home with an infant, and I'd never done that, and I was going to take a little break. And so I did, and during the course of that break, which lasted a little longer, I was watching the 11 o'clock news one night, which people used to do.
I was just going to say, I remember that.
Yeah, remember that?
I don't think I've stayed up till 11 in the last few years, honestly.
Yeah. What was I thinking?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But on flashed the image of a young Marine killed in Iraq who I recognized as the son of a former client of mine.
Wow.
Oh, wow.
Obviously devastated. And I called her and I went to his funeral. And at his funeral, one of his high school teachers eulogized him, saying in part he joined the Marines because he felt like he'd never had a family.
Oh.
And I sat in that pew and I just thought, my God, the time, the emotion, the money, the energy that we had put into that case. And by many metrics, the outcomes had been good. But clearly this young man hadn't been left feeling whole. And I sort of sat there and I thought, if I'm going to go back into this practice, I'm not going to go back that way. I'm going to do something different. And I don't know what it is, but like if I can honor his memory in any way, it's going to be by creating something that's better than what we did. And that was really the beginning of my going back and almost like tracing paper, thinking of overlays on the law that could better equip families to restructure to optimize their outcomes. And that would include ultimately two theories that I landed on, one being psychological and one being a business restructuring theory. So what the Consilium process does is it integrates these two other processes into the divorce process, and it works whether or not you're mediating, litigating, arbitrating, conciliating, collaborative law. It can work in any process because it's a perspective shift and it's teaching lawyers how to think differently. So, and then it's integrating with mental health therapists and financial professionals to create sort of a sturdier foundation for families to launch and ultimately become self-governing.
So that's interesting. So when you go into this, is it sort of like a here are the paint by numbers? I don't want to overly reduce this, but like, is it sort of like, here's the guardrails that we're all going to agree to play by during this process?
Sort of. I mean, I think there are a few things that I guess I'd highlight as being unique. I mean, one is that it only takes one person. I always sort of equate it to like putting a pebble in a stream. It's like you can divert it and it just takes one person. So a lot of other, processes everyone has to sign an agreement or be on board or be in the court or whatever it is. You have to sort of either have agreement or have a contest.
Right.
And here you just have to have an intention. And it helps the person who's going through the divorce to collaborate and sort of have a vision that is teamed with yours so that you can work together toward an outcome. But it also it creates sort of a simultaneous path of growth along with the divorce. So there's an upfront acknowledgement that if you're divorcing, like that's happening. That's an experience you're having, but it's not who you are. It's never have I had someone walk into my office and say, what I really want at the end of this is a court judgment. Like, that's why I'm
Right. Yeah.
So,
You know what I've always wanted? Yeah.
I've been dreaming about this for years. So you have a pain point and you have a reason that you're coming to someone who you think can solve a problem. And part of what happens often is people embark on this and they find 6 months later, like, this is so not what I thought was going to happen. I'm worse off than I thought I was. I have less money, less time, less, like, all the things, right? And there was no perspective on this. There was no thinking of, like, okay, so this is where I'm unhappy and this is where I hope to go. So if I look at if I'm talking to someone who has kids who are 5 and 8 years old, my immediate thought is, okay, so you're going to be co-parenting for 18 years.
Yeah,
so
right.
We're starting 18 years down the road and we're working backwards. I'm not starting with filing a complaint and seeing what kind of judgments we can get on an asset division, child support, and spousal support, which are all important. But that's like the tip of the iceberg as far as I'm concerned. It's also not addressing the why. Why are we doing this? And what can a court give you for satisfaction? And what can a court not give you? So if you feel betrayed, angry, like there's a lot of emotional contours that you think the court will address, that's really going to be unsatisfying because it's not going to happen. So how do we pull in the mental health support you need now to allow you to deal with those, complexities in a real way so that you can then attend to the legal issues that a court can attend to and give financial wherewithal by dealing with the financial people up front and not doing what typically happens in the traditional process where spend a couple of years getting divorced and then you say this is your asset settlement, and by the way, maybe you should talk to like a financial planner who can help you like understand what to do with this lump sum of money.
Just kind of leaving you to your own once the paperwork is finalized.
Exactly.
So I've never actually thought about this at this level. I haven't gone through a divorce myself, but I've been through plenty of like divorce adjacent experiences, right? I know plenty of people that have been divorced. And it's funny, it never occurred to me to ask that question, but it does seem to go the other way, right? We start with asset, if we want to go back even further, we start with who cheated on who's not giving sex to who's not,
why are we not
like,
compatible anymore? Yeah.
Right. It's always like we start with the blame game, then we move into the who gets what stuff game. And then I've never actually heard the last part, right? Like it just sort of ends there.
It also feels like the way you're approaching it, like, some people I feel, they're going into divorce for like justified reasons, but they're looking for that vengeance.
Right.
Like they're looking to punish somebody else.
Right.
And how often does that leave you feeling empty afterward too? It's like, oh, I really wanted to hurt them, but in fact, you're just, licking your own wounds.
Right. I very early in my career, I had a judge say to me, I was probably making an argument that didn't go very far. That, the courts make legal judgments, not moral judgments. And I tell people.
And do you know how fucking irritating that probably is to hear from the
oh my God, it's painful
from
too,
the plaintiff
like
or the defendant.
I'm not going to do what's right. I'm going to do what the law allows me to do.
Yeah.
But it's accurate. So when people feel, my husband cheated on me and therefore he should pay, then I'm going to go to court and make him pay. It's like, and there are lawyers, sadly, who will say, yeah, we'll fight for you and we'll go in and we'll do that. Well, that's not going to happen. What can happen though, and I have had happen with the Consilium process, is when you start really understanding, how the relationship derailed and, what went on with the affair and, how all these things, it's always more complex than you think. But there's a lot of guilt. There's usually enough guilt to go around. So one situation I can remember from a number of years ago, this woman had come in to me and she said, I want to get the biggest bulldog in Boston who's going to go and get him. He's like a big earner and I want to take him for everything he's worth. And I said, how's he feel about everything that's going on? And she said, actually, he feels horrible. And I said, well, what do you think he would want if I were talking to him right now? What do you think he would be telling me? He'd say, well, he wants to look really good at the end of this. He doesn't want everybody to blame him, even though he's the one who had an affair with the secretary. He wants to come out smelling like roses. And I said, well, what would do that for him? And she said, well, he always likes to be like the, BMOC, and he's always throwing around, how much money he makes. And I said, well, you think he'd pay for the kids to stay in private school and commit to paying for college for everybody for the next, 15 years? And she said, yeah, I think he would. I said, okay, well, maybe if we approach him on that sort of frame of reference. Long story short, he ended up hiring a lawyer she recommended through me after we'd, positioned her. And he did not only agree to that, but her spousal support was far and above what she ever would have, what a judge ever could have ordered.
Right.
Because the approach was so different. And, he was so, he so much didn't want sort of a public display of his bad behavior.
And I almost feel it's disarming too, there's a look, you're not coming at me with rage. Let's end this almost diplomatically and here's what we need for our family, even though it's separated.
Well,
That's
and
right.
you see that a lot. Where I've seen this similar idea is life insurance payouts. And when people are planning life insurance, they almost view it as a lottery win. And I'm like, yeah, but the person that you love just died.
Dead. Yeah.
And this isn't so you could take a world cruise. This is so you could pay for your kids' education. You could pay off your house. You could do things that person would have provided in your relationship. This isn't winning the lottery, nor should it ever be treated as it. But I can't tell you how many people, and I don't even do this professionally. I'm just talking about my knucklehead friends who who've talked about it. I mean, I think it speaks to sort of the confusion that happens when you start talking about money and separating money from outcome, right?
Yeah.
And in your mind, what I love what you say is you start with outcome and then you work backwards to money, which is a significantly different line to draw.
And it seems when you go back to the sort of the whole, I guess, my upbringing, it's how hard is it really to say, put books on tape if people learn better auditorily than visually, give it to them that way. It's sort of flip it on its head. It's sort of I don't know, my husband always refers to it as a disruptive innovation. Like the ketchup bottle, the one you squeeze and you shake it forever. It's sort of why was that so hard to think up? But, it's sort of giving people the tools. I mean, for lawyers, it's you get very, you do what you know, and sort of you learn a process and it's just easy to get on and ride. And so it is a different way to approach something. And lawyers aren't trained in psychology. They're not necessarily comfortable having conversations, that are in the emotional realm. And they don't want to be therapists, nor should they be. But being curious and asking questions that attend to someone's real needs, why did someone ever tell them that wasn't part of their job? That they couldn't do that?
Heidi just hit the point of the show, right?
Right.
It's be curious and ask questions.
Yeah. But what your mom was doing, though, the thing that we glossed over, and it wasn't kind of the time to say anything then, but since we came up again, your mom was touching on stuff that's exploded over the last decade, which is how many learning styles. Forget about dyslexia. Take dyslexia out of the equation altogether.
How many other needs do people have? Yeah.
Autism and the whole, now it's people just talk about neurodiversity, of course. But it's it was written in the 80s, I think, called All Kinds of Minds.
Yeah.
And that was a pretty early, he had actually worked with my mom. But
see, that's the thing. Why didn't anyone just say, hey, again, put dyslexia to the side. Hey, if I'm a musician, maybe I learn better auditory, right? And I taught art class at FIT and Pratt, and both of those classes, what we didn't do a lot of? Reading. We did a
Yes.
lot of looking and touching.
Yeah.
We didn't do any reading. Why? Because they're art students. They don't give a shit about reading. They're not going to learn like that. Like, that's not how they're going to absorb information.
You know, there's that famous it's not a political cartoon, but it's a cartoon where there's a teacher sitting at a desk and he's got like 4 different animals. One of them's a fish, one of them's an elephant, one of them's a monkey, and whatever else. And he goes, "All right, your final exam, we're going to see, you want an A, climb the tree."
Yeah.
Right. And it's like, well, we all can't climb the tree, and it doesn't make any other way of thinking or thought process less valid or less intelligent. It's
right.
Heidi, I got a question for you. Do you feel like your particular way of doing things was helped by this kind of the term is conscious uncoupling, where people are starting to look more at can we do this in a more ethical way, or was this just good timing for you, I guess?
How can I answer this?
You could just say no if it's
No. I'm blanking Catherine's last name. I wrote Conscious Uncoupling.
Gwyneth Paltrow, I believe, is where I heard.
Gwyneth Paltrow is the one who...
I always take swings at her.
Oh,
I feel
my
bad.
No, she's the one who promoted it.
Yeah.
But Catherine, oh gosh, hold on.
Did Gwyneth Paltrow consciously uncouple from somebody? Is that how this came?
I think it was. Was it the Coldplay dude, right?
Yeah. No, I know. Yeah, and didn't he bang the babysitter or something? I feel like there was
that seems like a pretty conscious reason to uncouple.
Yeah,
No,
right.
I guess I have 2 things to say about it. Catherine Woodward Thomas is her name. And
Okay, all right. Gotcha.
So I've actually partnered with her on some things.
Oh,
because our perspectives aren't diametrically opposed. That's for sure.
Mm-hmm.
I think this idea that that conscious uncoupling, I think, is first of all, it was developed by Catherine Woodward Thomas for one person, sort of like Consilium. It was just like helping someone understand their own process. It then
you mean like a client at the time kind of thing, or a patient? Yeah.
Exactly.
Wow.
Exactly. Like to attend to their own sort of inner, that's not so dissimilar, right?
Yeah.
It then became this conversation, partly because of what Gwyneth Paltrow said, I think, but also because it sort of evolved as being like 2 people can work together to consciously uncouple, attend to what their mutual goals are and their priorities and how they're going to get there. Okay, that's great. That's sort of part of Consilium. That aligns. I think the idea that people promote celebrities, maybe for PR purposes or otherwise, that we're we're just a one big happy family and we're just doing this in a really conscious way and it just didn't go the way we expected or we're moving on. That sort of is a double-edged sword in terms of how it serves people. Because I think that there's there's always a backstory. I mean, people don't just decide to get wake up one morning and decide to get divorced.
Right.
That's not usually how it goes. So, but I think this piece of working together, and I do sometimes work with couples as well, to help them reframe and restructure how they want to envision their sort of next chapter. And part of what I use as the paradigm of Consilium is a business restructuring model called the 5th discipline, was created by somebody, Peter Senge at MIT, for businesses. And it's sort of when a hierarchy breaks down, and I always use the analogy of bankruptcy, saying, when a corporation files for bankruptcy, they can dissolve or they can reorganize. But somehow when a family or a couple is divorcing and they have children, there's one option. There's one box to check, divorce. It's but that's not even true. You are restructuring is the word I use. So
that's interesting.
You are not, no matter what the judgment says, no one's leaving the planet, or presumably.
Assuming you're not. Yeah. Assuming
depending on how bad it gets.
Yeah.
Maybe leaving the country, but we're I don't know. So I think
But you don't even see that. People don't generally do that either, right? You're usually going across town or maybe a town or 2 over. You're not, you got to be near this human for more than likely for a while.
Especially if there are kids involved. Yeah.
Right.
Right. So we've talked about the 90% of cases, not the 10% of cases. First of all,
Sure.
so few cases go to trial, so few cases are contested, but they all start with this idea that it's going to be a contest. Like, I mean, unless it's a mediated divorce, which many are, but even so, there's this idea that we're separating, going our own ways. And if you have kids and you have money, that's just not what's happening. So you are restructuring. There is a new hierarchy. There are maybe two. I often visualize it as a Venn diagram and say, if you were one sort of circle, you will no longer be. There are going to be your separate entities in this third overlapping piece. What do you want that to look like? What are the boundaries? And sometimes, look, if this is domestic violence case, kid cases where the boundaries are going to be really severe, maybe there will not be interaction in ways that were traditional at all because there need to be, or there are restraining orders, or there are lots of reasons why when we approach a case, we may say, these things need court involvement on these axes.
Right.
But maybe there are ways that there can be relationships or supervised visitation or other things that can continue a relationship.
But at the end of the day, I think, and I've always had really complex feelings about divorce because I have a biological father who's dead now, who I never met, who obviously wasn't enough of a figure to be contributory to me in any way. I never met him. But that's sort of been an ingredient in my history. And I know that one of the reasons that happened is because there was substance abuse involved on his side. There was, as the story goes, some kind of incident where he wrapped my mother's car around a barn. And there's some other, it didn't strike me as a super healthy relationship. They started very, very young. It was a whole thing. And the picture that sort of stuck in my head wasn't super warm and fuzzy. And when you look at if you look at this briefly through the lens of last night's conversation, if your trauma is sort of percolated around 0 to 5, that would sort of square up nicely with why it's complicated. I don't want to say it's good or bad because it's really not.
Yeah.
It's
I feel like,
complex.
Matt, though, everybody would view divorce as complicated.
But no, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
But not really, no. So that's where I was going with this. If you look
you don't think so?
So if you look at, say, the circles of the men or the women pick any one divorce, right? And if you were to go out to drinks or happy hour with her group of friends or his, it's not complicated. She's a bitch. He's an asshole. There's a lot of that going on.
I'm going to just interrupt for a second.
No, please.
Yeah. That's why you're here.
Yeah, that's what what we pay you for, Heidi.
We're paying the guests.
I think that's as you said at the very beginning, when you start unpeeling the onion. So that's the surface. You're hearing, all these sort of broad sweeping statements. And when you talk about getting curious or asking deeper, more difficult questions, and I'll give you a couple examples, or at least one from yesterday, actually, a conversation I had with somebody. There's a lot more there. So you just talked about your biologic father, and then you had, I think there was a man who was, the father in your life.
Yeah.
So that's really impactful. And I think that everyone has a backstory. Everyone's story is bigger than that sort of initial broad, brush sweep. So often when I'm talking to people, I will hear about their parents' divorce, for instance. So someone's talking to me and I'm hearing, that their parents were divorced when they were 10. And I'm looking at their family configuration and realizing they have a 10-year-old. Okay. So that's not uncommon. So in an instance like that, I might say, tell me about what your experience was like. And I've heard everything from I was the poster child for contested divorce, I was the front page of the newspaper, all these things. Okay, so you bring that into your divorce and your child and your dynamic. And if you if you don't look at that a little bit at the beginning, you might repeat it. Your inclination might be to do what you know. We're creatures of habit. The imprinting is there. But if you say, how did that feel? It was horrifying. whatever the fallout was from that. So I hear that. Okay. Do you want that to be your child's experience? Tell them. Like, that's the last thing I want my kid to go through. Okay. So what can we do? What can we put in for scaffolding for your child so that they don't have that happen? So I think the art part of this is that, right? It's when you're actually taking that step back and doing the family history piece, which is also part of Consilium. And I expect lawyers to do that, which they don't typically do on an intake, but on a Consilium intake, they do, is we need to understand that because we need to unpack it before we can move forward.
So are you sort of sitting on top of both legal representations, or are you representing one side?
How do you end up working with, in the divorce?
Yeah. So the practice, I'll give you a couple answers, because the practice I developed is the Consilium consulting the practice. And I am either generally hired by, it's probably about 70% of the time, I'd say I'm hired by one person. So to help them work through the Consilium process. And that's everything from hired legal counsel. I write a very detailed synopsis. It's a legal, psychosocial, financial analysis of a case that goal sets and sets priorities and determines process and does a lot of things. That document is deployed to a few different lawyers that we sort of handpick because we think they're the right, sort of have the right hardware. And then is what's the software. So then my client needs to meet the people, but because I state the narrative, they don't have to retell the story. And part of the exhausting part of hiring a divorce lawyer is that you tell your story once and then you feel like, my God, I finally said it. I don't want to say it again. So they feel like I interviewed the person and they were pretty good, so I'll hire them, or my sister-in-law used them, or whatever. But that's not usually the best way to approach this. So if the stories, this document's usually, 12 to 15 pages long, it's detailed. And then we craft questions for the client. So if there's a prenuptial agreement and I think clause 4 is problematic in some way, I'm going to create a question that asks each lawyer for an answer about that. So the client will then hear 3 different answers and say, well, that resonated or that then. They come back. We are able to go through it and then really, test what would be the best match for this client. So by the time they've hired counsel, it's very different process. And then I stay on the case as a consultant. So
that's interesting.
Okay. So I am involved in every way from, I can be drafting documents. I can be assisting in court prep. I can just be there to bounce ideas off of things for the lawyer, for the client. It depends on the complexity of the case. They tend to be somewhat complex cases and, they take different form. So that's most of the time. Sometimes people will say, well, I still mediate. So there are times that I work just as mediator with both parties. And then there are times people say, can you meet with both me and my husband? I think you could help us goal set, prioritize, and all these things where we think we're, feet apart, not miles apart, but we need help sort of distilling that, understanding the law. And I'll help them both hire counsel in a negotiated settlement or a collaborative law settlement. So I'll sort of position them for that process. And everyone will see that document that says, this is where they're aligned. This is where they're not aligned. Don't muck up the things where they're good, work only help on things like that.
So I got 2 questions for you then. The first, if we're front loading with all this information, which seems really wise when you pull back, does this in the long run speed up the process,
100%.
lower costs, even though they're hiring a third person? And then my next thing is, because you're consulting, does that give you the ability to work in other states than Massachusetts?
So I've worked in other states and other countries because the Consilium process is agnostic as to the law. I'm only licensed in Massachusetts, so I only would advise on the law in Massachusetts. I have trained other consultants, one of whom is in Colorado. And that's, it works seamlessly with any legal process and with any sort of law. So that was, you had
It seems highly duplicatable, right? Like you can easily port this to other people.
Right. So that's why we started the Consilium Institute. So the
right.
Consilium Institute is, wrote a book a few years ago with my now partner, Judge Field, Julie Field, who is an old friend. That's another great backstory, which I can give you. But we lived together as children in our 20s on Capitol Hill.
Wow.
For a very brief period of
that's
time,
very
I'll
cool.
just say. And we always sort of stayed friends, but there was no Facebook, no Instagram, none of that. So we wrote letters.
Oh, Jesus.
Anyway.
Back at you.
The dark ages.
The dark ages.
Exactly. But ultimately, she became a family law professor and then a judge. And so at a certain point, we wrote a book. She said, you know, what you're doing is interesting. I would like to learn about it, talk about it. And we did. And we wrote this book. And what was, for me, really unique and cool was that she was on the bench. So once I trained her in the Consilium process, she was able to apply it from the bench. And she's writing a book on before Consilium court orders and after Consilium court orders.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah. So her whole change happened while she was on the bench. Then I said, all right, so you've been on the bench for about 11 years. Any chance you want to step off the bench and found this institute with me? So she was like, let me think about it. So we then did a really deep dive into creating curriculum and thinking deeply about how we could deploy this and establish an institute that would really change. You know, we've tried to change laws from the bench. She has from, you know, legislatively, I've worked on stuff. She's worked on stuff. I mean, there've been a lot of things, but we thought we really need to get into the weeds with people and do this. So we've now trained 30 lawyers, and we have another, I think, 15 or 20 signed up for this coming month that are lawyers, mental health therapists, and financial professionals. So it's a national networking organization, but everyone speaks the same language, because in order to participate in it, you have to take the course. And she's in Colorado. So that's the way so everyone, but then can say, hey, I need a financial, advisor who understands the Consilium process and can give me illustrations up front and isn't just looking for, dollars to invest at the end of this, but is actually on board to help someone restructure their family financially.
And it's funny, I've obviously been doing business for a number of years now, and the older I get, the more I'm like realizing that a lot of professionals, especially super high functioning professionals, almost paradoxically don't want to do the work. They're like, look, my happiest day is when we do the least amount of effort to get to the maximum outcome possible, right? And so like I could almost see this turning into like, I don't want to go through the old fashioned style, because I know if it's Consilium based, this is going to scoot through much quicker. Everyone's going to be less pissed off. This is going to be better. Like if I'm going to practice this form of law, I'm only doing it under this umbrella.
Well, I think you're right. And I think that there's so I guess sort of like an unexpected, byproduct is lawyer mental health improving. And
sure,
people say this over and over again, it is a huge burnout field, and lawyers in the family law field, it's taxing. It's, you're mired in negativity constantly.
Sure.
And this doesn't do that because it is based in positive goals. So when someone says to me, and this is, me in the broad sense, to any Consilium practitioner, what I really want at the end of this is to go to business school. I always wanted to, but I never did because I got pregnant, had children, whatever. And I'm looking at, okay, so under the law, you're entitled to spousal support for 9.5 years. You're telling me you want to go to business school. Maybe we can front load some dollars to pay for you to go to business school and shorten the length of spousal support. Appealing package on both sides, maybe, because this person who feels like they're going to be paying for 9.5 years, all of a sudden is only going to be paying for 5 if they pay for an education up front, for instance. Right. So things like that, once you start opening up the conversation to a forward-thinking perspective, instead of just, taking a blunt knife and cutting the assets in half, it changes everything.
Did either of you guys ever watch The Sopranos?
Yes.
Yeah.
I
Do you
think it's
remember?
derogatory towards the town cult.
Yeah,
No, I don't.
yeah,
No,
no.
I just never got
So-
into it. No,
So there was an episode. Do you remember the episode where the grandfather, like the dad of Tony Soprano, was in prison and the only way he can get out was to get a day pass for funerals? And he would just go out relentlessly. Every day he'd be at another funeral because he's like, it gets me out of prison.
Right.
And then like a month later, he's at dinner and he just starts weeping uncontrollably. And he's like, I don't know what the fuck's wrong with me. I'm just crying. Everything's sad. What's the fucking point? Like, and it's like, because
analogy, my God.
every day he was just like, God damn, everyone's dead. Everyone fucking sucks. This life sucks. It's not worth living.
Unbelievable.
And he just kept eroding and eroding and eroding. He's finally like, fuck it. Prison is better than this shit. I can't do this anymore.
Hey.
And I just, as you were saying that, I'm like, I can't even imagine. I just can't even imagine how hard it is. I know two videographers that are videographers because they used to be on-air newscasters, and both of them were like, I met people on the worst day of their life every day of the week. Every day. Like, everyone I met today was their worst day that they've ever had.
Right.
He goes, that wears you down after a while. Like, it's just exhausting.
Definitely.
And I'm like, I can't even imagine, because it's not just with lawyers too, especially if you're, the ambulance chaser type or the sort of bottom feeder type.
Right.
It's constant aggression. You're on offense all the time. And Tom and I, both lifelong martial art practitioners, we know the value of hard and then soft and then hard and then soft.
Yes.
Like, you've got to go back and forth, because otherwise it's just,
Exactly. Well, it's interesting. I was just talking. This is someone who's becoming a Consilium trained lawyer, and I was talking to him, and we always have calls and interviews with people beforehand, and he's someone who really was saying exactly this. He just felt so depleted. He felt like he was becoming, I'm going to misstate his words a little bit, I'm afraid, but he was becoming someone he didn't want to be.
Sure.
And he just felt like he was always looking for people's weaknesses and how to exploit them. And that was his job, in a sense. And he said, that's not who I want to be in my life. So I think there's so much truth in what you said. And I think that the other thing that, when you talk about people wanting to do less as they're more experienced, I think there's a financial model there too that is not great, which is, the associate does the work, the partner doesn't. The partner sort of chimes in to give, important and valuable feedback, but is billing at a higher rate. So I don't know. I mean, we don't need to dig too deep into that to see where it goes. But I just think that there are better ways to make money.
Sure. God, it's so funny because you're talking and like, it's refreshing to hear, the issues that I think most people associate with lawyers. Lawyers are well aware of. They're clearly not thriving because of that. But it sounds so much like the issues with even medical systems.
Yes.
Right. And the number of times I've had conversations, and because I'm alternative practitioner, they'll be like, oh, well, the doctor's this. And I'm like, oh, you don't think the doctors know that's no, they're 100% behind everything you're saying. They know that this is the system and it's horrible and there is a better way. Right. They're just in that system.
Have you read,
oops.
I'm sorry. My daughter's home from school.
No worry. That's life.
And,
the life podcast here. Yeah.
Have you read Being Mortal by Atul Gawande?
Somebody recommended that to me a couple months back, and I don't think I got as far as putting it in my Audible, but I'm going to right now, actually, because...
Yeah, you may be interested. I wrote a blog a while ago, probably at least a year ago, about that, exactly what you're saying, Tom, about the parallels between the medical system and the legal system in terms of these alternative views. Because he talks a lot about, elder care and death and dying and nursing homes and how that developed, which was really like we don't have room for these people in the hospital. We got over here. Like, it's sort of like when you look at the court system as a parallel and how they deal with families, and I use that somewhat pejoratively, intentionally, I guess, because it is a deal with as opposed to a thoughtful, restructuring of, as I say to people all the time, families and people aren't, they don't, you can't parcel them up. They're not just like parts you can redistribute. Take me, and I'll take the torso. We're like a series of interactions. And until you analyze what the interactions are, and part of Consilium again is, what is the interaction right now in the relationships? What is dad doing? What is mom doing? Who's the soccer coach? Who's, preparing lunches? Like, all the things that are really happening on a day-to-day basis. How do you, when you restructure, what happens? That system gets blown apart. So what is it that becomes? And, if you don't think about that, then it's just, the chips fall where they do.
Right.
And that's not usually good.
Yeah, and what I really love about this is like there's nothing in my life that has not improved once I kind of mantraed to myself, slow down to speed up. Like, it's like become like a recurring sort of theme in my life. It's like, okay, because my whole life, man, it's been like 300 miles an hour forward. And I mean, my kids make fun of me. Like, nothing triggers me more than having to go back and repeat a step that I just did. Like, if I fuck something up and I have to go backward, God, I lose my shit. I am like completely dysfunctional. And my dad's made fun of me for this. My mom's made fun of me for this. My brother and sister, my wife. I mean, literally everyone in my orbit is like, dude, why are you getting so bent out of shape? All you have to do is pull this nail out and hit it again. I'm like, fuck, that's like 8 seconds. I'm never getting back. I got, and I'm just like going forward. And I'm just like, but as I'm a little older, a little wisering, I'm like, hey, you know what? Maybe slowing down at this point is probably better off, because now I can go twice as fast later on. And that's very appealing. So,
That's right.
And so I love this approach, because you're like, hey guys, look, I mean, this guy wants to go to business school. She wants to start a gardening company. Let's figure this out. And everyone's super happy.
Right? Yeah, I also think it's brilliant as a negotiation tactic. Look, I'm not coming at you. Clearly, neither of us are happy. What's the long-term goal here for both of us?
That's right.
And you really reframe that, and yeah, you're not that it's still pleasant or happy. It's a lot easier. I mean, even talking about like how like Matt, you said it before with people dying and then getting that inheritance, like having that conversation with my parents where they're like, "Don't worry, when we die, you'll be fine." Right. And I'm like, "Wait a minute, I love you guys."
Do you know something I don't know, Mom?
When's the last time you've been to the doc? What did they say?
Hey,
why are we doing this?
Yeah, but I mean, I think, look, it's a metaphor for everything in your life, really. Like, it's like, look, I mean, there's a way that you can go at it with a sledgehammer, and then there's a way you could not, right? And like the not is almost all. I mean, I've actually don't think I can cite a single example where the sledgehammer was a better option.
Right.
Wow,
it's the immediate option, and it's sort of
I think that's our reptilian brain coming out.
I almost feel like that's the ego reaction.
Yeah, right.
Oh my God, they're doing this to me. I better go get them.
It's the classic, you paralyzed or you fight or flight.
Yeah.
You do. And, there are a couple examples I can think of if you want to spend a little time or not. But as we've been talking, there are a couple of things that have just happened this week that were, I think, emblematic of when the process works well and when it doesn't work well.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'll give you 2 examples. I mean, one's something I've been helping someone on. So this was the anti-Consilium case from 2007. Contentious, horrible. I had nothing to do with this divorce, but just as bad as it can be, I would say. Kids who were very young, 5 and 8 years old.
Yep.
Dad who became, mom and dad just weren't communicating effectively at all. Mom took on all the things having to do with the kids. Dad felt really outed by this and sort of escaped, for lack of a better word, but really wasn't present for his kids growing up. So fast forward many years, 17 years or so, and here they are. Mom's going back to, and she got alimony, and he was out of the country. And so he kept paying to his detriment because he, A, should have modified it and it should have been terminated, but he didn't because he was just ignoring everything. B, he was going more and more into debt because he couldn't afford the payment. So finally, he's remarried, he has another kid, and he thinks, I got to do something about this. So he wants to go back to court. So now, like, where are these little 5 and 8-year-old, where are they now? So one is about to graduate from college, applying to med school, thriving. Mm-hmm. One's got some significant mental illness and addiction, or, addiction disorders. So mom wants like all the credit for the kid who's thriving and wants to blame dad for everything that's happening.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Exactly. So it's sort of like, that's what she's presenting to the court. This is all going to court on Monday. So, you read these two parallel statements, right? And one is, she's a saint. And, but for the fact that the dad wasn't present, this other kid would be fine. And then you read what the dad's saying, which is, I won't say heartless, but he just wants to start his life and move on with his family and not have these financial obligations and put it behind him. And he has really limited relationships with both of these, children, which is sad, but he also is sort of, in his own mind, sort of bifurcated his relationships. He was alienated. Well, not alienated is a terrible word to use, and there's lots of reasons for why in terms of the court, but he didn't have a relationship with them that was meaningful. And it was sort of the worst outcome. I consider this pretty much the worst outcome you could have.
No, it sounds like he checked every bad box you could. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
For sure. And you're going to go to court and ask the judge to then look at this and reassign and reallocate the law, which I won't get into, but in terms of whether or not alimony should continue and whether or not this now adult, he's not a child, he's emancipated, should get any continuing support, or the mom should be credited with having contributed in ways that the dad didn't because she was the only person present. So bad outcome. There were so many better ways that case could have gone. So I'm going to give an example of someone I talked to yesterday, just on the cusp of divorce. So 2 grown kids, a marriage and a business that they'd collaborated with. And then dad sort of, again, left the country, wanted to start a new life, didn't want anything to do with payment of anything, but sort of comes back periodically and mumbles about divorce, but doesn't make any, doesn't take any steps toward it. He sort of has the best of both worlds. He has a place to lay his head down when he comes back because she keeps saying, you're welcome in the house. And he keeps leaving and having multiple affairs. And she's well aware of the fact that he's doing this. And she's really angry and hurt, but feels paralyzed. So, what are her options? In her mind, she's waiting for him to tell her he wants to get divorced. She doesn't feel empowered. She doesn't feel like she's an agent over it. Why? Well, what are the financial complexities? She doesn't understand that. So helping her unpack like what the financial ramifications are up front and how she could position herself led to a conversation about her writing an email to him saying that instead of filing a complaint and what's called a motion to vacate, having him removed from the house, starting in a very sort of contentious way, writing to him and saying, it seems that we're not really in a marriage at this point. It seems that you want to move on, in your life in other ways. It seems that we need to sort of reconfigure, and sort of laying the foundation for why she wants to stay in the house with her child who is still living with her, and positioning this as a reasonable solution to a problem that seems intractable for them right now. He can say, I don't agree, I'm not leaving voluntarily. But if he does that, she's already at least given him sort of an olive branch and said, this is how I'd like to proceed. If that doesn't work, but don't, her inclination was to let him come home and then have a conversation. She said, I just want to have a conversation with him. It's like, well, you've been having this conversation for 3 years.
Right.
What's going to change now? And why have it in the house when you already can define it yourself?
Correct.
So if you define it up front and say, by the way, you're not welcome to come home, get a hotel room if you want to come back to here, but don't expect that you're going to be welcome here when you come here. So then you've sort of decided where it's going. So
yeah, and I think that also does a second thing too. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it sets sort of like I don't want to say puts him on his heels, but it certainly, frames it differently in the sense that
it changes the dynamic.
There's no back door to this like there has been in the past. Like I've sort of laid down a sort of pathway that I'd like to go on.
She reclaimed her power in doing it.
Yeah.
It's sort of like she went from being passive and the recipient of whatever he was handing out to saying, no, this is the way it's going to go.
Right. We're going to have to recalibrate here because this isn't working.
So I guess part of that, and your role in that, Heidi, drawing on your mental health background there, you have to, basically ask this woman, why are we allowing this? Right. I mean, they're
right.
Yeah.
100%. And having her answer for herself,
Yeah.
He hadn't applied for COBRA. She didn't have health insurance, but she had it available through work. She just was too paralyzed to have applied for it.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, there are lots of pieces that sort of fall, but she had to be activated and she had to be empowered to take it upon herself and say, okay, I can do that tomorrow. I can go sign up for health insurance tomorrow. Awesome. You do that. And
it's those little things that must be mentally just so unburdening, right? Like, I mean, you get to a point where you're like, guys, you know how cool it is? Like, sign up for COBRA. Everyone's like, fuck is this person talking about? Like, yeah. Like, and they're like, no, you don't understand. This was massive. Like, I mean, and I just, that's such a cool thing to see for somebody, right? Like, you're like, oh my God, I love that you just did that.
Right. Yeah. So I think just giving people sort of that hope and that ability to sort of be an agent for themselves.
Right.
And I think, you can argue, this isn't law, but it's what allows people to move on. And if our goal is to help, not only my role, not only as helping the individual before me, but their family and the next generation and the generation after that.
Yeah.
These things are societal.
But I think, and this could be a whole nother conversation, but I think unfortunately in this day and age, like law and everything else got pushed together. But law was really never, at least my interpretation of it, it was never meant to be morally judgmental, or anything like that. I mean, it's just like, I know we have in our country separation of church and state. And I know one of the biggest arguments against some of the hot button issues of today are the fact that line between religion and politics can often get blurred. And I'm like, see, this is just a slow erosion of pushing together two things that were not really ever meant to go together. So that sort of dissonance that happens isn't because there's a problem necessarily with the systems, but it's the not recognizing that they are systems, plural, and not a system.
Right.
Singular.
That is definitely a whole other conversation.
Yeah. Like the system is doing exactly what it was designed to do.
Yeah.
But the dual role that lawyers do have, though, and I think lost in the conversation, is lawyers are charged with being zealous advocates and wise advisors. So the wise advisor often gets sort of shunted to the side. Wise counsel is what a counselor is, a counselor at law. So, people sort of lean hard on the advocacy piece. And I think, Consilium, which actually means Council of Wise Advisors, that comes from the old Latin of, in days gone by, judges would call upon their Consilium, which was the family, the people who knew a family best. And each, it's sort of like, this is a little ecclesiastical, but it's like, we're just sort of recreating what already existed in terms of creating a Consilium of wise advisors, which is, the people who can help a family move forward most effectively.
See, that makes me just chuckle a little bit because it's like, we already knew this answer. What the fuck happened? Like, how did we forget this? Like, it just doesn't make any sense.
Well, it seems like we can apply that to almost any topic at this
but
point.
It's every topic. It's like, that's what I'm saying. It's like,
why are we so dumb that we forgot to do this?
Right. Right. Yeah. We can't get out of our own way.
And Heidi, that seems almost like the lowest tech, like of tech. You're like, oh, all we did was ask the people who knew the most about this. Like, oh,
right.
Okay.
Right. Hello. Right. What was the hard part?
Yeah, no, that's crazy. So, I mean, I guess it seems low, from my perspective or from my vantage point here, that this is really picking up momentum on your side. You guys are training more people. It seems like this sort of secret's getting out. Where do you see sort of this going? Like, what trajectory are you on here?
Yeah, well, we hope to train people across the country. We have had some international interest too, which is exciting, but we're starting small, just the country. So we'd like to build a national network of people who have this perspective and, can change the dynamic for families so that we as a society really can be healthier in this way.
Sure.
I mean, I think there's just great need and, we just want to fill that need. And, if people are interested, they can go to consiliuminstitute.com and we're courses that are remote and courses that are in person. And we go into law firms and other, established places that have us come in and do in-person trainings. And we do remote trainings pretty much every month.
Wow.
Heidi just wrapped it up for herself.
I know.
Like, we didn't even have to ask. I was like, that was like,
all my
you were right on time. We didn't have to queue. We didn't have to go, hey, where do we find you? You did it all.
Yeah, I love low motivated people like Heidi. These people are really awesome.
I'll run it from here. You guys just nod.
So this is the book we wrote back a while ago called Dissolution to Evolution. And it's available on our website. It's available on Amazon. But
we'll definitely link to it.
Yeah, we'll link to it.
Yeah.
So we
actually have a book. We have a title, like a data field in our show post that has their book. So I think it's actually called their book.
It's really funny.
Yeah, because this is a recurring thing. So
yeah. Well, we wrote that for people we thought would want to read it, but we then realized that people were taking it to lawyers and lawyers were like, Consilium, what? Like we need to create the ecosystem so that the people, when they go asking for it, the lawyers know what they're talking about.
Yeah.
Because I've never had people who come to me and I tell them about this or have this conversation. I've never had them say, yeah, no, thanks. We'll do it the old fashioned way.
Well, sure. I mean, sometimes just hearing there's a different way.
Yeah. Is enough to kind of start asking
enough
questions.
To be like, well, yeah, that's probably not incorrect.
What I love about this conversation is like you kind of humanized divorce.
Yeah.
Yeah, which it sounds so weird, right? It's happening to people, but like you look at it as like this almost like mechanical, hey, we just break this shit apart and that's it,
Right. But it's so not that, it's like, people are more than composite parts. That's just not.
Well, it takes the fangs out of like the divorce part, right? Like, so you're not quite as, I guess, terrified of it because I think it's a very anxiety riddling.
Oh yeah, it's gotta.
It's scary.
Yeah.
I mean, right? I mean, it doesn't diminish or take away the fact that that's true.
Yeah.
But the question is, what do you do with those emotions and how do you unpack it in a way that is productive and helpful?
Right. But if you use that health insurance example, you're like, all right, so if I have $300,000 in my house and I need 100 for each kid, so there's 500, and then like I need a little bit more just in case. So like an insurance policy of $750 will probably get me to where I need to be. Like that's different than being like, how am I going to afford a $5 million policy? Well, what the hell do you need that for? Right. Like, I mean, that's not like why we're not even having the same conversation here. What do you mean? Right.
Exactly.
And I just think
arguing and having lawyers go back and forth,
right. Which basically who wins in that? It's mostly the lawyer.
Mostly the lawyers. Yeah.
Like, mostly the lawyers,
Yeah. 100%. We could have a whole conversation on war stories of crazy letters and correspondence that have gone back between lawyers.
We will probably have you back for that one.
Yeah. Well, what I like, and we don't have to go into this because I know we're pretty much done, but I like that you sort of brought in a vernacular that a lot of people understand, which is the business side, right? And you see this in contract arbitration all the time, right?
Mhm,
Like
mhm,
you
mhm.
owe me $100,000 for services rendered. Well, I don't want to pay it because you fucked this and this and this up. And then you go back and forth. You're like, I'm calling my fucking lawyer. Like that's like step 1.2. You know, it's like just like right after. And
Mhm.
and then you sort of say, hey, okay, we could do that. Or we can just figure out what moves you to the point where you're paying for this.
Yeah,
and,
where can we find
like,
common
what do
ground
we have
here?
to do
Yeah.
extra to get what we thought we were owed? You know what I mean? So
The other conversation that may be interesting to have at some point is how people hire lawyers. And in terms of, I mean, the dissatisfaction people feel sometimes, in my estimation at least, comes from people often people who feel disempowered, hiring someone who is, a powerhouse, right?
Right.
Who, in essence, maybe they felt that way in their marriage as well. And then they end up feeling in the relationship with the lawyer similarly to how they felt in the marriage. So it's sort of like, this is not necessarily a good thing to replicate.
I can see that happening for sure.
Yeah.
Well, because you seek out, it's like your next girlfriend or boyfriend might not be all that different from your previous boyfriend or girlfriend.
Yeah.
Right? Like it feels like, people have patterns. I get that. I mean,
and they're going to fall back into them if left to their own device.
Right.
Yeah. And if you're getting out of a shitty marriage because of X, Y, and Z, and you hire a lawyer who's doing that same thing, you're like, even if you ended where you thought you would, I'm sure you don't end up feeling the way you thought you'd feel. And the journey is definitely not probably as fun either. So,
for sure,
well, Heidi, man, I literally I love that you shared some time with us today. This was awesome.
So much fun.
I actually, even though we've talked a couple of times, I don't think I really had a really deep understanding of what you guys were doing, and this is definitely paints a different picture for me. So,
I'm glad. It was wonderful to talk.
Yeah, it was very cool. Thank you so much.
Thank
great.
you.
Well, have a good weekend, guys, and enjoy.
You too. Enjoy.
Take care.
Yeah. All right.
Be subversive, irreverent.
Health is wealth, but you knew that.
Everybody knows that.
But so is following us on social media at Irreverent Health. And check out our website for more exclusive content at irreverenthealth.com.
Oh, I like this.
Thanks for tuning into this episode of Irreverent Health.